Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the gospel as it goes to the barbarians in our continuing study of the history of Christianity. I'd like to begin by talking about Ulfius. He's in the 300s, a child of slaves, and raised among the Goths. He comes south, gets to know Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia. Remember, we had talked about Eusebius as one of the on the wrong side of the Arian controversy, but Ulfius now returns to become a missionary to the Goths, and in doing so, he translates the Bible into the language of the Goths. That's going to be a key element, going to a different culture, learning their language, translating the Bible into their language so that they have the Word of God as well. Now we look at the invasion of the Huns. The Huns were in Eastern Asia, and all of Asia was their territory, and we see them now moving into Europe. Of course, when they're moving, anybody's territory that they're moving into is going to be dispossessed. But they were actually threatening to come down into Italy, and Pope Leo in 452 goes out to meet Attila the Hun. Attila was there with his army in his tent, having come out of the steppes of Asia. And Pope Leo goes up to the tent, asks for where is Attila. He's in there, and Leo goes into the tent, and everybody's waiting for, oh goodness, his head to come flying off, because the Huns were known as vicious warriors. And after a while, Leo comes back out. His head is still intact. Attila comes out, and Attila says, guys, we're leaving. We're not going to invade Italy like we had planned. We'll go and invade some other place. What happened in the tent? Did Leo tell him about Jesus? Did he give him a bribe? We simply do not know. But the status of the Pope after this, the Bishop of Rome, remember that's his technical title, is going to be greatly elevated as the savior of all of Italy. Now, as I said, once the Huns begin to move, yes, they don't come down in Italy, but they have bumped into a number of other peoples, and so we have the Goths trying to get away from the Huns, and one group of the Goths goes to the west. We know them as the Visigoths. All that means is the Western Goths. We've got another group that move across the English Channel to become the Angles and the Saxons. We have a group that crosses the Straits of Gibraltar and comes into North Africa. They are the Vandals. In fact, when we talk about vandalism, that's where we get the term from. The Vandals are not. They're not neat neighbors. Let me put it that way. When they come, actually, they're going to come into Italy, and they're going to vandalize Italy. There's another group of the Goths that swing over to the east, and so we refer to them as the Ostrogoths. All that means is the Eastern Goths. And so we're going to have Gothic peoples all over. That's actually going to impact our culture. Today in my culture, men, some women do, but men wear pants. That's a Gothic invention. Romans never wore pants. They had their togas, but that's something that the Goths brought with them, and it's a style that has caught on. Next, we want to talk about Patrick, and probably you've heard of Saint Patrick. He grew up not in Ireland, but he grew up in England in a Christian family. But he was captured by pirate raiders, and he was made a slave, where he spent some time. Now, when you picture a slave, oftentimes you might picture somebody in the bottom of a ship, or working in the mines. But you have to remember that Ireland in his day had no large cities. And so Patrick, as a slave, is put in charge of watching some flocks. In other words, he's going to be a slave/shepherd. He says, I was like a stone lying in deep mire, and he that is mighty came, and in his mercy raised me up, and indeed lifted me high up, and placed me on top of the wall. Patrick escapes his slavery. Now, Ireland is an island, so I'm not sure how he got off, but somehow he managed to escape, get off the island, get back to Europe, and was ordained as an adult now as a priest and as a bishop. And now he returned to Ireland as a missionary, not as a slave, but I suppose you could say as a slave of Jesus Christ, to tell them about Jesus, and had an extraordinarily positive impact on the island of Ireland. Patrick was the first to speak out unequivocally against slavery. Perhaps because of his experience, I think that's very likely that that colored it. But he said, let's do something different here in Ireland. Let's not have slaves. And to at least a large degree, he made it stick. The slave trade in Ireland came to a virtual halt, while slavery everywhere else in the world, New World, Old World, China world, everyone, slavery continued unabated, but not in Ireland. Ireland, after this, becomes a center of missionaries to England. You see, once the Roman Empire falls, 476 AD, you're going to have Rome taken over by some of those barbarian tribes. Um, after Rome falls, they have colonies in England. And all of a sudden, one day, the governor has been called back home, and we're not doing that. And the whole province, the Roman province in England, just says, okay, we're not doing this anymore. Goodbye. You're on your own. And so England, which had been part of the Christian Empire, suddenly had been cut loose, as well as Scotland. And so Ireland now is sending missionaries back to England to remind them of the faith that they've forgotten. And eventually you're going to have Irish missionaries also crossing the British Channel and coming into Europe as well. Now, as they come into Europe, you'd had back in Ireland a monastic movement. We talked about monasticism already. Of course, monasticism in Europe was usually close to to civilization, close to cities, but there were no cities in Ireland. So monasticism there had taken a very different turn, and one of the things that monasticism in Ireland had become known for was its studied affiliations with education. You see, in order to be a priest in Ireland, you had to learn Latin. Not because they spoke Latin in Ireland, but in order to read the scriptures, in order to read anything, because Ireland didn't have anything in writing. And so every priest became a priest scholar. And this idea of scholarship now becomes part of the monastic movement here in Ireland, and that's going to catch on as they come in contact with the rest of Europe. From the Confessions of St. Patrick, he says, "Therefore may it never befall me to be separated by my God from his people, whom he has won in this most remote land. I pray God that he gives me perseverance, and that he will deign that I should be a faithful witness for his sake, right up to the time of my passing." And indeed, Patrick was a faithful witness all his years. Now, this is going to give rise to Celtic Christianity. They'd been cut off, as I said, from the Roman Church when Rome pulled out of Great Britain. But now you begin having these Celtic monasteries with a scholastic emphasis, and the bishop here would be under the abbot. You see, normally the bishop was the big local guy in charge. You had the bishop, and then if you had monasteries, they had to answer to the bishop. But this has been turned around for the Celtic monasteries. And it's the abbot who sort of oversees everything, which is going to give that same scholastic emphasis to all Christianity within the Celtic communities. They had a flexible membership. On the continent, when somebody went into a monastery, they were making a vow they were going to be there for the rest of their lives. The Celtic monasteries, no, you would go in for a time if you wish, and then you could leave. You could leave. It was only as you wanted to be there. And if perhaps there was somebody wealthy that wanted their son to get an education, there were no colleges, there were no universities. You would send him to the monastery, where he would get both a religious education as well as a classical education. He'd learn Latin, he would learn to read and write, he would learn to make copies of the scriptures. And so the membership there was flexible. Now, one of the differences, I'm not sure how this came about, but they had begun observing Easter around the time of the Passover. That sort of made sense. Whereas the continent had taken a different observance. And when they came back into contact with the continent, there were a few differences that had risen up. One, like I said, was the observance of Easter. The other was the Roman tonsure, this Roman-style haircut that would be done by the monastics, and the Celts had never seen anything about that. And the folks on the continent said, "Well, if you want to be a monk, this is what you have to do." And they said, "Oh, okay, it's not a big deal. It looks sort of funny to us, but we'll go along with it." And they did. Now, 476 we have already mentioned as the fall of Rome. Now, that doesn't mean Rome disappeared the next day. When I say the fall of Rome, that means I'm not going to have a succession of Latin Roman emperors, but instead it's going to be ruled by outsiders who have come in. The first of these is going to be Odoacer, who comes in, takes over, and he says to the young Romulus Augustus, the teenage emperor, "Tell you what, you don't have to be emperor anymore. I will take care of business. You go down, and I'll set you up where you can retire in southern Italy. Have a nice day. Don't call us. We'll call you." There was supposedly a plaque at the Colosseum that said, "While stands the Colosseum, Rome shall stand. When falls the Colosseum, Rome shall fall, and when Rome falls, the world." The fall of Rome, in one sense, for the average person, nothing really changed, at least in Italy and Gaul and the surrounding areas. But as I said, for people in Britain, suddenly the people running things had picked up and gone home and were not replaced. Who's going to who's going to fix the roads? Who's going to repair the bridges? Who's going to make sure the waterworks are working? There was suddenly, they'd gone from a very specific chain of command and authority to no authority. And so the only person in authority very oftentimes was the local bishop, who wasn't really trying to seek power, but he was the one that people looked to for leadership. And so now the bishops of the local communities will become the de facto leaders of those communities. Enter Theodoric. He's an Ostrogoth noble, happens to be Arian, and had been a hostage in Constantinople. But now the emperor of Constantinople, and remember, Constantinople still has an emperor, still has the Roman Empire in the east. He sends Theodoric to Italy to take Rome back from Odoacer. So the idea of the emperor is yes, the the empire in the west fell, Rome in the west fell, but we're not going to leave it fallen. We're going to take it back. We're going to raise it up. We'll reunify it, and everything will work out. And so Theodoric goes back to Italy. He has a meeting with Odoacer in which they form a treaty, and they call a big feast to celebrate. And at the feast, Theodoric murders Odoacer, assassinates him. Which means that the Roman Empire has fallen, but the one who caused it to fall is out of the picture, and so it can now come back together, or not, because Theodoric now establishes himself as the ruler of Italy. And he sends word back to the Roman emperor in Constantinople. It's okay. We've reunified the empire. You stay there. I'll stay here. I'll rule it in your name. But gee, I really wanted to rule it personally. Oh, don't worry. I have things covered here. And so whereas on paper, the empire is reunified. In reality, it is not. All they've done is changed which barbarian is running the empire, and it's not going to go back to any of the Roman emperors. Now, Theodoric makes a number of alliances. First with Constantinople. Like I said, it was initially going to be this is one empire, but they do iron things out. He also makes an alliance with the Franks. In fact, the Franks, that's why we call that country France instead of Gaul, because of them. And he marries the sister of Clovis, and we'll talk more about Clovis in a bit. He makes an alliance with the Visigoths, those Western Goths, and with the Vandals, who in the past had come down and vandalized. Here's a map of the different tribal groups that are ruling. Notice we have the Ostrogoths in northern Italy, the Burgundians in southern France, the Franks that are going to give their own name. That's why we're going to call that France. The Angles and the Saxons in England, the Jutes in what we call Denmark today. Of course, we've already seen the Visigoths and the Vandals. Clovis, the king of the Franks, we mentioned one of the alliances that's made with him. Clovis is going to change things when he becomes a Christian. And not only does he become a Christian, he says, I'm going to be a Catholic Christian. That is not an Arian. Remember how we've seen Arianism as a problem. He says, no, I'm going to embrace Catholic. And what I mean by Catholic isn't Roman Catholic. I mean by that the sort of universal, the Christianity in keeping and following the various church councils that we saw in an earlier lecture. Now, Clovis says, I'm going to be a Christian. My nation's going to be a Christian with me. And that means we all have to be baptized. He says to his soldiers, you guys need to be baptized. We need to pull this off rather quickly. Soldiers, take your horses and ride through that river, and that will be your baptism. We need to get you wet. And the soldiers don't know that much about Christianity yet. Now they will learn, but as they ride through the river, they've heard about these Christians who believe in peace and forgiving your neighbor and things like that. So they take all the soldiers hold their right sword arm out of the water. They don't want their arm baptized because they want to still continue to fight. Sort of a humorous, probably one of the more humorous baptism stories. Clovis will begin what we know as the Merovingian dynasty. It's going to go from 481 all the way to 751 and will only be replaced by the Carolingian dynasty. We'll talk about them when we get to Charlemagne and his family. So Clovis has his rise to power. Like we said, he converts to Catholic Christianity, and notice how the empire is, even though the barbarians have come, they themselves are being conquered by the church. They're becoming part of the Christian family. Next, I want to talk about Gregory the Great. He's the first monastic pope. That is, he had been part of a monastery, and now he becomes pope. And as such, remember how we talked about the monasteries in the West had a tendency to reach out to the local communities. He's all about doing that, and he wants to bring an emphasis to the church in reaching out to these barbarian peoples and to other peoples, as far as bringing the gospel to them. He sends Augustine, not the Augustine of Hippo that we talked about earlier, but Augustine of Canterbury is sent to England, and local customs are given a Christian significance. For example, if they have a certain ritual that they do, don't tell them to stop that ritual. Instead, make it a Christian ritual. If they do something around a tree, or if they have certain songs, take those songs and put Christian words to them. Use the culture to teach them about Jesus. And that's Gregory's contribution. Now, he also brings about a number of liturgical reforms. In fact, to this day, you can go online and listen to Gregorian chants, and they are exquisitely beautiful. So be sure to do that at some point. And these are some of the reforms that he brings about to the church. So he says that illiterate men can contemplate in the lines of a picture what they cannot learn by the written word. So let's use art in order to teach Jesus. And again, it's a wonderful idea. Of course, the danger is when that art becomes an object of worship. And so there's a fine line, and Gregory doesn't want us to cross that. I think he's doing a right thing here. He wants to use artwork, whether it's statues, whether it's drawings, but in order to teach the gospel, but not to use those as things that you will begin to worship. In other words, he doesn't want to go to idolatry. And that fine line is going to be a difficult one to follow. Now I want to talk about the Heliant. It's a retelling of the gospel story written in Old Saxon, so this is in England, dated to the early 800s, and it attempts to make Jesus culturally relevant to a warrior class. And to do that, Jesus is described as a warrior king, because that's the only sort of person that that culture respected. In the story, John the Baptist is called a soothsayer, because if they say prophet, they didn't have the word for prophet. They didn't know what that was, but they knew about a soothsayer, somebody who would supposedly tell you hidden knowledge and maybe tell the future. Here's a portion from that. Christ's warrior companions saw warriors coming up the mountain, making a great din. Angry armed men, Judas the hateful man, was showing them the way. The enemy clan, the Jews, they didn't know what a Jew was. The enemy clan, the Jews, were marching behind, the warriors marching forward, the grim Jewish army, until they had come to the Christ. There he stood, the famous chieftain. Christ's followers, wise men deeply distressed by this hostile action, held their position in front. They spoke to their chieftain. "My lord chieftain," they said, "if it should now be your will that we be impaled here under spear points, wounded by their weapons, then nothing would be so good to us as to die here, pale from mortal wounds of our chieftain." Simon Peter, the mighty noble swordsman, flew into a rage. His mind was in such turmoil he could not speak a single word. His heart became intensely bitter because they wanted to tie up his lord there. So he strode over angrily, that very daring thane, to stand in front of his commander, right in front of his lord. No doubting in his mind, no fearful hesitation in his chest, he drew his blade and struck straight ahead at the first man of the enemy with all the strength in his hands, so that Malchus was cut and wounded on the right side by the sword. His ear was chopped off. He was so badly wounded in the head that his cheek and ear burst open with a mortal wound. Now, if you recognize that story, it's not quite the same way that is told in the Bible. Notice it has gone through a cultural adaptation to make it more palatable to the people of Britain, to that warrior class. Next, I want to talk about Dionysius Exiguus, Dionysius the Humble, the Scythian monk in Rome, who will also put his mark on society. In fact, he puts his mark on our calendar because he had calculated the birth of Christ as taking place 525 years before the consulship of Probius Jr. That is one of the can't really call him an emperor. A consul would be like a president, but there would be two of them. And he was trying to decide trying to figure out from history and from the Bible exactly when Jesus was born. He made this calculation and he missed it by a few years. And so they had already the Julian calendar, but their years went back to Diocletian. And Diocletian they had reckoned as year one in the calendar that they were using. And a new system was eventually adopted. Now, it wasn't adopted in the lifetime of Dionysius, but using his reckoning, the Venerable Bede, a English historian in 731, will adopt that and publish a new calendar with a new system of reckoning years that will date back to the birth of Jesus. But as I said, he will have missed it by a few years. He meant well, and he got close, Sort of like the old story of close only counts with hand grenades and nuclear bombs and horseshoes, I suppose. But he did get close. But that date is going to stick, and to this day, we still use that new system that was adopted by Bede. So that right now, as I'm speaking these words, it's the year 2020. And that doesn't mean that Jesus was born 2,020 years ago. Actually, it was a few more years than that. He missed it by a few years. Meant well, but missed it. Finally, I want to talk about Boniface. Boniface is another missionary going up to the Germanic tribes, and he gets there and he notices that those Germanic tribes, they are worshipers of the Norse gods like Thor and Odin, and they have their sacred oak tree around which they gather, and every time in the winter they would gather asking Thor and Odin, bring back the sun. The days are getting shorter and shorter. And so they would gather around the sacred tree and they would have all their various rites as part of their religion, praying to Thor, praying to Odin. And Boniface comes up in the middle of their ceremony with an axe in hand and begins to chop down their tree. Well, they've never seen anything like this, and they're waiting for Thor. After all, Thor throws out his thunderbolts. They're waiting for Thor to strike this intruder dead. And Thor doesn't do anything because Thor is just an idea, pagan god that doesn't really exist. And so Boniface chops down their tree and then proceeds to tell them a story of a Messiah, a deliverer, a savior who died upon another tree. And then explains how that they can celebrate his birth and they can do these sort of course. Now, I'm not saying this is how Christmas was originated. Christmas had been around for hundreds of years, the celebration on December 25th, much earlier than this, going back even to before Constantine. But he takes that, and notice that idea of adaptation, of using their culture to tell the Jesus story and make it more understandable to them. And there's a sense in which we try to do the same thing even today. We try to explain Jesus in the terms of the cultures to which we are addressing. That doesn't mean we change the story, but it does mean we look for those points of commonality to better explain and better understand what Jesus came to do.